Dr. Katie Gibbs. She is, I would consider, one of Canada's leading science advocates. She started her career while she was a PhD student as a lead organizer of the Death of Evidence rally in Ottawa, and she then went on to found Evidence for Democracy, which is Canada's leading science advocacy group. They've been the driving force behind really successful campaigns such as the Science Pledge during the 2015 federal election, as well as Support the Report campaign, which led to significant gains in science funding in Canada. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Dr. Katie Gibbs.
So I'm going to talk about science advocacy. So I'm going to give a little bit of a fairly short background of like how I got into this position and how I came to do what I do, mostly just to kind of set the stage for all my experiences. Then I'm going to talk through a little bit of kind of the theory of how science informs policy and how public make decisions around which policies to support. And then I'm going to actually kind of break down almost like a how-to guide for how to do a science advocacy campaign. So I've kind of tried to take what E4D has done over the past few years and kind of break it down into a step-by-step guide. So I'm going to go over that with some specific examples to kind of clarify what I'm talking about. And then, as Molly said, then we're going to give you guys a chance to kind of put it in action and hopefully come up with some of your own ideas. So, this is just a little bit about me and my background. So I went into science because I wanted to save all the endangered species. Really all of them. So I thought I would go into science. So I did an undergrad in zoology at the University of Guelph, then a PhD in macroecology at the University of Ottawa. And I think probably like a lot of people, I started to get pretty frustrated in my PhD that it seemed like hardly any science was actually being used or even seen by policymakers. And especially for someone like me who really went into science wanting to do it to inform policy, I was pretty frustrated that it didn't seem like science was informing policy. So then at the same time I was working on my PhD, I got really interested in the question of, so if science isn't informing policy, what is? Like what drivers are influencing public opinion and influencing politicians? So I did a lot of volunteering. I volunteered for Let's Talk Science. I volunteered in a local community group in Ottawa, and I did a lot of political volunteering as well. I did a lot of work with Green Party Canada. And then all of this was also taking place during the Harper government years, where there were a lot of fairly consistent and persistent attacks on science. That was really frustrating for me personally, but also it was really clear that it was really frustrating to kind of everyone in our lab and in our department. We were all kind of grumbling about this. So I ended up helping to organize the Death of Evidence rally. We really wanted to kind of show and demonstrate that the science community was really upset by the policies that were taking place. And we were really expecting maybe 100 people to come to this, and ended up getting close to 5,000. So it was very surprising to us how much it seemed to resonate with people. And then after the rally, we kept hearing from scientists saying that was amazing. That was the first time I've ever marched in the street. It felt so good to be engaged. What's next? And we kind of looked around at who else was doing this kind of work, if there was an organization we could refer people to, and there wasn't really anybody doing this work. And especially at the time, it was during the conservative years, so the few organizations that work in the science policy realm were all very, very scared to speak out against the government. So they weren't really doing anything coming close to advocacy. They weren't really touching, commenting on federal policies at all. So we decided to start a new organization, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization called Evidence for Democracy, really with the mission to promote the transparent use of evidence in government decision making. So we do work around trying to make sure that science and research in Canada are well funded, openly communicated to the public, and used in decision making. So we've done a lot of different campaigns over the years. We actually just had our 5th birthday, so we've been around for 5 years. So I'll just kind of touch on them. This is a sort of collage of different people taking the science pledge in the lead up to the last election, and you can't see it, but there's people like David Suzuki and the Parliamentary Budget Officer Kevin Page in there. We did campaigns around bringing back the long-form census. We advocated for many years to bring back the Chief Science Advisor position, which we now have back. And we've done a lot of work to save this really important high Arctic research station called Pearl. So this is just kind of a flavor of the type of campaigns that we've done. And, you know, I went into all of this having a very formal science education and have really learned everything I know from trial and error. So I really, you know, like to kind of share what I've learned with other people, and hopefully you won't have to do as much trial and error as I've done over the years. So I'm going to go over just a little bit of like the theory to sort of conceptualize how we think of how science influences policy. So this is the linear model of science policy, and it, you know, it's pretty intuitive that, you know, science gets to the decision maker reviews all the evidence and then uses that science to make policy. There's sometimes another version of this where the public is included, so it's sort of like the science influences public opinion, and then the public opinion is what affects the decision maker, who then makes the policy. And so this area, sort of right between science and public opinion, is sort of where we think of science communication. And there's another model that sort of governs this interaction that's often called the knowledge deficit model. So, you know, this model basically states that when the public holds opinions that aren't in line with what the science says, it's because they lack information. So scientists need to do a better job of communicating their research, getting it into the hands of the public through science communication, and then the public understanding will kind of come in line with what the scientists think. Sadly, there's a lot of evidence that shows that the linear model of science policy is not at all how policy is actually made. It's actually much more complicated than that. It looks something like this, where you have a whole bunch of different inputs, and even this is a gross simplification, but really the key here is that science is one input into policy, and decision makers are taking it into account with a whole bunch of other things, including socioeconomic factors, legal issues, diplomatic issues, international issues. So science is just one of many competing inputs into policy. So what about the knowledge deficit model? Sadly, the same thing is true of the knowledge deficit model. There's a large body of literature that shows that this is not how individuals make decisions either. Generally, more information doesn't change people's minds about an issue. So there's actually a lot of really interesting science on what does change people's mind and how do people make decisions. So I think this is a really interesting sort of way to visualize it. So people make decisions based on knowledge, and this is really where new information can input into the system. But we also make decisions based on our values and rules, which I find it's best to think of that as sort of like social norms and social constructs. And it's even more complicated because they all overlap. So even how we take in new information is influenced by our values. So people probably know of the confirmation bias. So we're more likely to sort of take in and register and remember information that we see that is already in line with our values, and we're more likely to discard information that we see that goes against our values. And that's not even something we're doing consciously. It's actually like an unconscious way that our brain works. So I know this can be a little disappointing. It would be nice if it was the more simple linear model and deficit model, but I think it's really important to understand that this is the landscape. This is how the landscape looks, and so if, as scientists, we're trying to get more information to matter, both to how individuals make decisions and how policy makers make decisions, that it's really essential to understand this. The knowledge transfer piece, the science communication, you know, the other point I want to make here is that it is very important, but in most cases, it's not going to be enough to really change individuals' minds or politicians' minds on an issue. So things like, you know, SciComm things that we think of, tweeting about your research, sending it to decision makers, these are all helpful for sure. And they can sometimes be effective, particularly if, you know, the government is already on board with what you want to do. Then sending them more information can kind of help give them like more, it can arm them with more information to get it through. But usually we're starting farther back in a process where the government either doesn't want to do what we're trying to get them to do, or our issue just isn't even on their radar at all, and so usually just kind of giving them more information isn't effective. And so we're starting further back and have to actually sort of build the public and political power to make the change that we want to see. So that process is advocacy. So this is a picture of the Science March. Some of you may have participated in some Science March events over the past 2 years. Would you consider this to be advocacy? Show of hands. Yeah, most people saying yes, I would agree. This is an opinion article from 4 fisheries scientists pushing for a new Fisheries Act. Would you say that this is advocacy? Most people, yeah. And this is experts testifying to a parliamentary committee. Would you consider this advocacy? Most people, yeah. Yeah, I would agree. So really, advocacy is any activity that is trying to influence decision making. I think, you know, when I started my PhD a fairly long time ago now, you know, it was still really during the time when advocacy kind of seemed to be like a dirty word in science communities, and I'm really happy to see that I think that has already changed a lot over the years. I still sometimes come across some people being wary of scientists doing advocacy, but I think by and large, you know, we've all kind of accepted that it's not something scary and that it can actually be really, really helpful and necessary. And also, thankfully, in Canada, you know, we have seen some of our top scientists participating in things like the Death of Evidence March or the Science Marches, and you know, there hasn't been any negative effects to their careers. So I think we kind of have enough evidence now that it's okay to do advocacy work. And I think this definition is important as well, because it's like, advocacy is not really any big deal, it's really just any activity that is trying to influence decision making. Advocacy steps. So I'm going to go through them all briefly, and then I'll talk about each step with some examples. So this is kind of how I've broken it down. The first step is to clearly articulate the change that you're trying to make. So going beyond just stating a problem and actually going from the problem to what is a solution that would make it better. The second step is identifying who has the power to make that change. So actually trying to find the person or people. So what level of government, for example. And then 3 is something called power mapping. So that's really where you're trying to sort of get all of the players on a page. And so this will include people who are allies in what you're pushing for, people who are opponents, and people who are stakeholders. And then you kind of figure out how to include and use all these people. Step 4 is deciding on strategy and tools, and I'll give you some ideas. And then step 5 is really where the communications piece comes in, and trying to weave it all together into a compelling narrative or story. So, you know, a lot of this is planning. Like, a lot of people think of advocacy as just like jumping right into doing a campaign or writing a letter to the editor. And those are usually, you know, I would put those under steps 4 and 5. But those activities are going to be a lot more effective if you put that time in to really planning to make sure that it is as strategic as it can be. And, you know, much like the scientific method, this isn't really very linear. I presented it that way, but often, you know, things will change and you'll loop back around to previous steps. And sometimes the timelines can vary greatly. You know, sometimes we'll kind of run through all these steps for a campaign over the course of a few months. Other times, these steps might play out over a few years when you're trying to really push for a big change. So there can be a lot of variation there. So step 1, defining the problem and the solution. You know, this one is really where the evidence comes in. You want to put forward some realistic solutions, and this is where you want to make the strongest scientific case, the better. And I think this is where, you know, I often define like what we do as evidence-based advocacy or science-based advocacy. And this is really where that science piece comes in, is in making sure that we have whatever we're pushing for is evidence-based, and we can back that up with some hard facts. And so, you know, this is where the research comes in, and obviously this helps if the research questions are policy relevant from the start, and if you've consulted policy people at the beginning. So this is an example from an opinion piece in a policy online magazine type thing. And so the government put out some proposed policies around the Species at Risk Act. And so a bunch of biologists wrote up this opinion article. And what I really liked about it is that for each of the policies that the government was putting forward, they commented on a strength. And realistically, like, this column was probably just to like make the government feel good. Like, whenever make the government feel good. Like, whenever you're talking to the government, like, their egos matter, and so you always want to say something good if you can first, and then get into how they can do better. So I like that they included this strength column, and then they included key recommendations. And they didn't just say, like, they could have said strengths and weaknesses, but they didn't. They did strengths and key recommendations. So they actually gave some fairly concrete recommendations for things that they could do for each of these policies. And when you do that, you're actually being helpful for the government. Whereas if you're just saying why you don't like something, that's pretty annoying for them because you're complaining, you're saying you don't like it, but you're not actually offering anything constructive. So I think this is a really good example. So step 2 is identifying your target decision maker. I find that this one can often be the hardest one for scientific researchers, mostly because it requires some understanding of the political landscape. And if you're not used to it, it can actually be kind of hard to figure out who has the power. So at the base level, you can start with, you know, is it federal, provincial, or municipal issue? What department of government is it? And then you can make a decision around, do you want to take it to the political level or the public service level? So I think oftentimes people think of going like right to the political level, but sometimes if it's an issue that is already, the way I think of it is that if it's sort of like a tweak to a policy, you can sometimes try actually going through the public service level, which can be a little bit less, sort of more under the radar. Whereas if you're trying to sort of push the government in a different direction and it's a pretty big change, then usually you have to go through the political level. But if it's something aligned with what the government already has stated they want to do and are already doing it, but you're trying to kind of tweak how they're doing it, then perhaps try the public service level. The government actually has a really great search to help find federal public servants. You can actually just search them, and if you find someone who does, whose area of work is relevant to your research, reach out to them. Like they're pretty approachable, and they're unlikely to. They're certainly not going to get grumpy if a researcher reaches out to them saying, hey, I think my research might be relevant to your work. Do you mind if I send you my latest paper on X when it comes out? Worst case scenario, they may not reply, or it might be the start of a really helpful relationship. So an example for this, we did a lot of work around a pot of money under NSERC called the Climate Change and Atmospheric Research Program. It was a pot of money that funded atmospheric science, including this really important high Arctic research station called Pearl that I already mentioned. And this was actually a pot of money that the Conservatives funded, and it expired in 2018. And everybody assumed that the Liberals would renew it because it's climate and it's science, but they didn't. And so we ended up doing a lot of work around trying to get that money back. So because it was under NSERC, NSERC is under the Science Minister, Christy Duncan, so we went to her first. She said, oh no, because this is climate, it's under Catherine McKenna's file. We also talked to the actual public servants who deal with NSERC within the ISED department. We also talked to staff in the PMO's office. And so this is kind of an example of how it might not always be one person. In this case, we were kind of getting the runaround of everybody saying like, no, that's not my file, no, that's not my file. And we were actually kind of able to use that to our advantage. We were kind of hearing very different stories from all of these people as to what was going on, and so we kind of played each of these groups off of each other in a sense to kind of get what we want. But it is an interesting example of how sometimes it might not be very obvious, but pick one, try it, and they'll tell you if they're not the right person and they'll point you in the right direction. So step 3 is called power mapping. So here's where you really want to think about who does your target care about and who do they listen to. So which constituents are they most likely to listen to? Who are your allies? Who's opposed to you? Who can you move and who is unmovable? So who can you get on your side and who is, definitely not on your side and you're not going to convince them, so they're not worth your effort. And are there any stakeholders that you need to include, and how are you going to include them? So I usually use this really helpful grid, and often, even now after doing this for a few years, I'll still kind of sketch this out. It's really helpful to get all of the players sort of on the page and think about who you want to engage, essentially. So it's a grid, it's pretty straightforward. There's one axis that is sort of who is the most influential and powerful and least influential and powerful. So this is actually like who are those decision makers, but also those people that your decision makers listen to. So those are very influential people for you. And then how much do they support your issue? Are they strongly support or are they strongly opposed? So here's kind of an example. Can you guys read this, please? Yeah? Okay. So here's kind of an example example for that CCAR example that I just ran through. So, you know, we put like E4D supporters, the Pearl PIs, the Pearl staff, they were all like highly supportive, the most supportive, but not super influential. Then we also, because this issue involved climate, we decided that a lot of environmental NGOs would be really good allies. So we worked with people like Ecology Ottawa. So we put them as more influential. So they're interesting because they're an Ottawa environmental group, really strongly on board with climate, and also very strong presence in Ottawa, which is Catherine McKenna's riding. So there was a bit of that strategic, sense that their supporters would be more influential than even our supporters because they're based in the riding of one of the ministers that we were trying to target. So we put them up there. Then we have the two ministers we're dealing with. It's obviously very powerful. They were supportive, but not super supportive. And then Lloyd Longfield, I think, is the, I think he's Guelph MP. Just an MP that had been really supportive. So, and then we have the ADM team at ISED. So these are the public service people that we had met with who deal with NSER. They were not, it was clear from our meeting with them that they were not super supportive, so we put them over there. So you can just kind of see how mapping them out is just a really helpful sort of brainstorming exercise to try to think about who are all the players involved and who do you want to spend your time targeting. Because like for most of you, any advocacy that you do is probably going to be in your volunteer time. Even at E4D, where this is my job, we still have far more issues than we have time to work on. So we want to be really strategic in who we're spending our time targeting, and doing this kind of mapping just kind of helps you hone in on where is the best place to use your time. And then the more typical things you would think of with advocacy, so strategies and tools. So usually for strategies, I kind of either go for an inside game or an outside game. How many people have heard those terms before? Like an inside game, outside game? Only a few hands. So an inside game is when you kind of go directly to the decision makers, sort of like behind closed doors. You don't do it publicly, you don't go to the media, you go right to the decision makers and try to get them on side. So that's an inside game. And then an outside game is usually when you don't get anywhere with the inside game, and so then you're trying to embarrass them maybe in the media to help you get your issue on their radar and to help you sort of get to the decision maker. So often it's really important to sort of think which of those strategies you want to try first. Usually I think it's good to try an inside game first, even if it's, I'm going to give one example where even under the Harper government, an inside strategy actually worked. So it really depends on the issue, but it's good to at least kind of pick one and be aware of which one you're picking. And then there's the kind of tools, which are the actual advocacy things we usually think of. Things like a scientist sign-on letter, op-eds, having meetings with decision makers, community meetings, infographics, policy briefs. There's lots of creative things that you can do there, social media campaigns. So this was a really interesting example, again, around the Species at Risk Act. So under the Harper government, they had indicated that they were planning to open up the Species at Risk Act. And biologists and ecologists did not want that to happen because they felt like if that legislation was opened under the Harper government, it would likely be gutted. So they circulated a scientist sign-on letter and got many, many signatures from ecologists and biologists saying, like, don't touch Sarah. And instead of like going to the media and getting a huge splash, which they would have if they had gone to the media, instead they got a meeting with the Prime Minister's office and kind of said, hey, we hear that you're thinking of touching Sarah, we strongly urge you to not do that, but just so you know, if you do open it, we are going to be like calling you out publicly for this, and we already have a letter with hundreds of people signed on, ready to go. And they never ended up opening Sarah. And the Species at Risk Act was really one of the only pieces of environmental legislation that didn't get touched during the Harbor years. So it's sort of like you don't really have anything to lose by trying the inside game first. And in this case, they were strategic. They didn't just go empty-handed. They kind of went in with some leverage from the start, but it paid off. Whereas if they had put that out publicly, the Conservatives probably would have said, like, well, we're already getting the negative media for gutting Sarah, and we haven't done it yet, so we might as well do it, right? So I think it was a really interesting strategy there. And I think I'll skip over this example. Oh, well, okay, I'll just do it to give this quote. So this other example is from the Fisheries Act. They did the more, because their advocacy started after the changes were already made, so they did the more typical approach. They wrote a letter in Science criticizing the changes. They followed it up with actual really good science, documenting the effects of the changes to the Fisheries Act, got that published, put out an op-ed. So they kind of did, everything in the toolbox to push the Liberal government to change the Fisheries Act. And this is a really great quote from Brett, who did a lot of this work. The bottom line is that we just hit this from all angles, constantly, and always from an evidence basis. Quite frankly, this only worked because we have a government that is accessible to evidence at the moment. I don't want to give the impression that my good science communication skills made this happen alone. Those skills were necessary but insufficient. And I think that goes to show that kind of point I was trying to make earlier, that the science communication is great, but on its own, it's not enough to actually change, politicians' minds, especially. It takes all of this other work as well. So then step 5 is the communications, and this is where you kind of put it all together and decide what the story is. And it's really important to think about who you're targeting and, what is the story that you're trying to tell. And usually I find it's helpful to try to use the language that the government already uses. So I often try to think about it of like, I try to think to myself, what is the story that the government is trying to tell about themselves? And how can I fit my issue into that lens? So, take a look at their mandate letters. This government put out public mandate letters for all of their ministers that really lays out what their goals are for their term. And so wherever you can pull from that existing language and kind of parrot it back to them of here's how what I'm pushing for is going to help you achieve your mandate, that is going to be more effective than trying to change their mandate or get them to think about something totally unrelated. So one example is going back to this climate and atmospheric science example that we worked on. We had done all these meetings, we still weren't getting any traction from them. So we wanted to do a scientist sign-on letter. So these are a pretty common tool. They're a little bit overdone. It's kind of like what every science advocacy campaign does is like, oh, let's get hundreds of scientists to sign on to this letter. So we wanted to do that, but there's still a lot you can do with this tool around which scientists are you targeting. So we decided to do a letter from international climate scientists to Trudeau, talking about how important Canada's climate science was to the world and to the field as a whole. So we thought that this would be really interesting, particularly because at the time, Trudeau was very much trying to sort of sell Canada as an international leader on climate. We know that this government cares a lot about their international reputation. Trump had also been elected, and so there were a lot of fears that this was going to hamper U.S. contribution to climate science, and so there was a lot of potential for Canada to kind of pick up that slack. So I think this ended up being a really effective angle, and we didn't end up getting a new pot of money for climate science, but they did end up giving some more money for that Pearl research station to help it stay open. So it was sort of a half win. So this is a lot of work. We're kind of like, right now just thinking like, whoa, I can't do all of this. I definitely want to just acknowledge that, yeah, it is a lot of work, but also that it's not something that you have to do on your own. Any good advocacy takes working with others, it takes partnerships. I think it's also, one thing that really surprises me in all this is that a lot of scientists don't realize that there is whole other fields of research around policy, around communications, around political science, and those are hugely informative. And there's probably those people who specialize in that research here on campus, and so I'm sure that they would be happy for you to reach out to them. And I think there's also a big area of this around acknowledging what you don't know. I feel like a lot of scientists are kind of like, oh, I'm going to do policy now, and just think that because they're an expert in their science that they can just be an expert in everything. But no, there is actually communications experts and policy experts, and let's learn from them. It's always helpful if you can find an NGO that you can collaborate with. Some of the best examples of science advocacy I've seen are when academics partner with NGOs. And just sort of acknowledge that it isn't always fast. Sometimes it does take years or decades to see change, but I mean, even looking back at E4D's time, we've been around for 5 years, and it's polar opposite of sort of what's happening now versus what the landscape was when we started. So huge change is possible, but it does take years. And I also just want to leave you with some further reading. These were some books that I found really helpful as I was in that stage of accepting what I didn't know and trying to find more research and reading that I could do in these other areas. So Honest Broker is a really great book about science policy. Moral Politics is about, it's sort of one of the best books that describes how values affect how we make decisions and how we vote. It's, if you're at all interested in sort of politics, it's a really good book that's fully backed up by research. Language Intelligence is a communications book written by a climate scientist who got really involved in communications after realizing just how hard it was to communicate. It's a nice, very short, accessible book. The first two are pretty meaty. And then the Geek Manifesto is awesome. I read it around the time I was starting E4D, and it's basically just sort of a call to arms for scientists to get more engaged in the public sphere and get more engaged on policy debates. It's a pretty light read, but really motivational, I found. So that's it. Thank you. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Otherwise, we could also hand out the worksheets and you guys could have some time to think it through, and then questions after that. What do you guys think? Are there any burning questions right now? Okay, I'll take these ones.
You suggested that you partner with an NGO, but I'm wondering if you have any suggestions about how to find the right one, especially if there's a few that might be doing pretty similar things, or just to kind of big umbrella and reach out to everyone.
That's a good question, and one I'm not used to because that's new, that there's lots of great groups doing amazing work in this space. So most of our funding from individual donors. So that's anything from, a lot of people give like $10 a month kind of thing. And then, some major donors who give more. Then we get, it's kind of like a third, a third, a third. So that's a third. And then another third is from foundation grants. And then another third is from like partner organizations. Mostly that's been like unions who have big scientist members, the union that represents government scientists and the union that represents academic scientists. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering if, like, in these two approaches of going to the inside or the outside, if one doesn't exactly have a contact on the inside, like, you're kind of left with essentially a public shaming, something closer to a public shaming strategy. Is the role of the chief scientist to kind of, like, serve as a bridge for scientists to communicate with government? I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that role, because
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think that's probably true a little bit that, if you don't have a contact, but it still doesn't hurt to kind of formally go through that internal channel first. Even if you don't have a contact and you're just like cold emailing or cold letter writing, I find often it's still good to start that way, because even if you do end up going the external, public shaming route, it's helpful if you can still say like, oh, well, we tried to talk to you first and you didn't respond to us. So I would still do it even if you don't have a contact. That's where groups like E4D can be helpful. Like, we are always willing to help people. We help a lot of people just like giving advice and that kind of thing. So, we might have some suggestions for who to contact. And then, so the chief science advisor, it's only been about a year. So I think she's still just been sort of figuring out exactly how her mandate's gonna work. I haven't really seen her office work in that way, just because I'm not sure they have the capacity. So I haven't really seen it work super effectively of like individual scientists being able to bring issues, but it's one of those areas where it doesn't hurt to try. That's one of those areas where you could write a letter, send an email, and see if you get a response. It's very low effort. Worst case scenario, you don't get a response, but maybe it will lead to something helpful. Yeah.
Does government ever come to you or to Advocacy and ask for, hey, we need expertise in this area, can you connect me with the scientists?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've had that mostly. It's interesting because we have that more from like individual MPs. So that there's a lot of different, when you say government, it's sort of like there's the public service, which is one level, and we've gotten those requests from public servants before. Then there's like the more political realm, which is like the ministers' offices. Don't really think we've gotten that request from ministers' offices. They have a fair bit of resources to do things like collect information. And then there's also individual MPs who, if they're with an opposition party, or even they're just like not a minister in their government, they are kind of independent and don't necessarily have a ton of resources. So we have gotten requests like that from individual MPs as well. So, yeah. Yeah, in the back.
How would you explain your work or research to a class of 10th grade science students?
That's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of different facets to our work. So, often I'm giving talks more on like the links between science and democracy, or I'm giving talks on why government science matters and why scientists need to openly communicate their research to the public. And then I'm giving talks to groups like you, where it's a little bit more like, I assume that you get all of those why questions, and so I'm really just focusing on how. So it really, it really depends a lot on who I'm talking to, but, I mostly just make the case that, well, again, it depends on which case I'm making, but often, it's things like, I think the analogies around, we have to, we all have to make decisions based on something. I see science as sort of being like, for getting from A to B. And if you have a tool like that, if you have a map, why wouldn't you use it? Like, why would you kind of, leave point A and just stumble around blindly and hope that you get to point B? Why wouldn't you use the map instead? It just makes a lot of sense. And, probably not with students, but with other audiences, I find the argument more around communications and open science, but the argument that, almost all science in Canada is funded by taxpayers. We pay for it. The way I see it is that it's our science. It belongs to the people, and so it should be made publicly available. Scientists should be able to communicate to the media. And then I also often make the democracy link of, a core tenet of democracy is that we have an informed public. And the only way that public is informed is if information is getting out to them. So these are kind of the three different arguments I would make. Yeah?
I was just wondering on a provincial level, do you have any tips, say, to scientists to collaborate with maybe less informed governments to become, say, a smaller province? Where maybe there's a lot of scientists with great ideas, but not a lot of NGOs around, and there's not a lot of scientific knowledge people, or people who really care on that provincial government? I know that's a tough one.
Well, it kind of depends on which case you're talking about. Like it is interesting in Ontario at least, and we've seen this a lot in the US, that actually and I'm not sure if this gets at the example you're talking about, but generally in cases where you've had governments sort of tighten the reins on government science, that's actually been a really great opportunity to increase collaboration of those government scientists with academic scientists. Like often that's kind of a way that they enable their work to continue, is by really sort of pushing things through their academic collaborators. So that when you see governments kind of shrinking government science, that is a really great opportunity for where academic science can kind of play a helping hand there. I don't know, did that get at your question, or was it something slightly different?
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Maybe here and then in the back.
Is there a better way of contacting ministers than just sending an email to Christy Duncan at Parliament BC? That's it.
You'd have to know who in her staff to contact. So even a little bit of Googling, you could probably find them on LinkedIn. They might be in Gibbs, that government lookup. I'm not 100% sure if ministers' staff are in there or not, and I could confirm. But usually you can find them online with a little bit of Googling. But that's also the kind of thing that, we're happy to point you in the direction if you ever are trying to find someone. But usually going through the staff person is going to be more effective than just the generic email. The other thing that's a really great tip, and so I should also add that this was kind of my bigger theory presentation, but we also have a bunch of toolkits that are more specific. So we have a budget guide of how the federal budget process works and where are the entry points for scientists. We also have a very detailed how to get a meeting and talk to your MP document. So those are both free and available on our website, and they're sort of a bit more nitty gritty of how to deal with your MP. But yeah, the other thing that's often really helpful is just calling. So you can call their office numbers and ask who would be the best person for me to contact about X. Yeah. I think we're gonna go back here and then there.
So what are some of the key issues that we should be worried about right now in Ontario that you want?
Yeah, that's a good one. So there's lots, and it kind of depends. I find some people, there's two ways to think about science advocacy. So some people are more interested in advocacy that is directly relevant to their own work. And that's more I deal a lot with conservation biologists, and that's usually their case. And then there's scientists who, are more interested in science advocacy more large, that is not at all relevant to their own research. So around things like, funding, scholarships, issues that are science-based, like climate change. So it kind of depends which of those you're interested in. You know, certainly we have a federal election coming up next year, and we at E4D are currently in the process of sort of finalizing our election plans. So I think you're going to see a lot of opportunities in the next year around that kind of like engaging candidates in your writing to, you know, try to push them on science issues. Certainly the federal budget is always a good sort of window of opportunity. Right now, basically now until December is kind of like the time period in which you can influence the 2019 federal budget. So there are a number of different things that you can do around that. And then there's other big issues, you know, that might be more discipline specific. So, you know, wherever there's issues of, you know, a lot of media sort of misinformation. So things like climate, carbon pricing, vaccines, whatever those kind of topical issues are usually really good opportunities to counteract misinformation with more evidence. I'm gonna go to the woman in green and then you. Yeah.
How does science journalism fit into what you do, and what do you think that writing about science is actually accomplishing? I'm interested in writing about science, but I'm not sure how effective that is at actually reading an audience that is ultimately going to change policy.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's, you know, so people are probably familiar with what's happened to journalism over the past, you know, decade or so, and Canada has not been immune to that. So we have lost a lot of journalists, and with that, a lot of science journalists. So I think now we only have one like full-time science journalist, Ivan Semeniak at the Globe, who's amazing. And then we have a bunch of other sort of science journalists who sort of do it here and there on freelance. So they, you know, they absolutely play a huge role in helping to kind of amplify the work that groups like mine do. You know, it's sort of like when we do a campaign, you know, we have a pretty good reach in terms of our, you know, email list and social media and our website and that kind of thing, but that's where we really need media to amplify it out larger than just our own audience. And it's much easier for us to make the case to someone like Ivan who gets science issues and is passionate about science. You know, it's easier for us to talk him into covering it than, you know, a reporter who is more sort of generic and not invested in science issues. I think, you know, science journalism also plays a huge role in just that general sort of public understanding of science and not just understanding of it, but appreciating it. So it does play a huge role. It's just that it's a very hard thing to do as a career path, unfortunately.
At the start, you identified those other factors that will influence the policy maker, the decision maker. How much do you engage with the arguments that opposing people present? And in what I see is most of those are economic arguments. And are there resources that you can use to help counter some of those arguments?
Are you talking specifically on things like climate change, environmental issues?
Climate change would be a great example. Basically short-term economic gain for long-term gain.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really tough one because I think, and I was just having a discussion with someone on Twitter about this yesterday around like, so the Current on CBC had on an IPCC scientist, IPCC. I'm used to saying 3 C's because of environment, climate change Canada now. Anyways, the Current had on an IPCC scientist and asked her, you know, the usual questions, and then also asked her a question around like political will. So, like, I think she had asked her, Anna Maria Tremonti had asked her, you know, what kind of changes are needed in order to like meet the 1.5 degree benchmark, and scientists listed all these big, infrastructure, societal changes that would be required, and then followed up with the question of, do we have the political will to address these? And the scientists kind of dodged that question and went more to like, well, we have all the technological tools we need to make these changes. Like, we can make these changes now. So, and someone on Twitter was kind of saying that this was a terrible communications because the scientists didn't address the question of political will, and that is really the key nut of the issue right now, right, is political will. We have all the evidence, we have the tools. What we're missing is political will. But I actually sort of argued back that I don't think that it was the job of the IPCC scientists to talk about the political will landscape. In this segment, they had two other people on, a journalist who covers environment and climate, and Catherine Cahill, who's a climate scientist who now works in a political science department and does more of exactly this issue of the political, where it touches up with the political. So all that to say is, when you are getting into economic arguments, that's where it is more economics than natural science. I don't necessarily have any good resources. For that issue specifically, there are some good sites like Ecofiscal. Have you heard of them? Ecofiscal, Smart Prosperity. So there are some really interesting think tanks that are dealing just with that economics issues and arguments. So to me, that kind of falls into that category of just knowing what you don't know, and there probably are other experts and academics who are doing it. So find them. Yeah.
So I'm personally kind of interested in sort of, I guess, localized environmental justice issues, for example, communities against open farm or a certain the type of situation in your area. And so I was wondering, in those situations which necessarily involve kind of a local community, if you have sort of more specific advice about involving the community in their own advocacy.
Yeah, I think those local examples are actually often a lot easier than the big federal ones. Usually you have a very specific target, whether it's that counselor, you have some local groups that you probably need to get on side, in my example, how, I turned to Ecology Ottawa, our local environmental group in Ottawa. So, that's where that mapping exercise would be really, really beneficial. And sort of thinking of, that's where that issue of thinking of who are the people that your target listens to and who do they not care about. So, if you have a counselor who's very, conservative and business-minded, getting the local environmental group on your side might not be that helpful because they just might already assume that the environmental group is against them. And so the environmental group coming out against them, they don't care. So that's where if you can find sort of unexpected allies, in that case getting a local business on side or the local business association. So that's where really trying to think of, you really have to try to get in the mind of the decision maker that you're trying to target and really think about who do they listen to that is also someone that you have any influence or connection with. And those are the connections that you want to follow and build relationships with. But I think that's a really good segue. So handing out the worksheet, and we can spend maybe 15 minutes.
Yep.
And you guys can sort of think through an example.
Yep. So everyone should have on their way and should have grabbed hopefully a copy of the worksheet. It has some of the materials that Katie talked about. If you could maybe just work with the people around you. We have some suggested or sample issues that you could talk about, or you can come up with your own. So stuff like carbon pricing, which today, by the way, is the last day to submit comments for
Yes.
the Ontario government. So this is a great way to brainstorm. There's also stuff about, you can talk about climate science, sex ed, affordable childcare, Me Too and STEM, all this stuff. You don't have to pick anything from this list. If you have something that you're really passionate about, please feel free to do that. But we'll work on this for 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll bounce ideas off of Katie.
Yeah.
Great. To you guys now, if you have any ideas you want to share, or ideas that you want to run by everyone else, Katie, or if you have more questions.
Yeah, it would also just be really helpful to hear, like, maybe what was really easy to come up with on the worksheet, what was really hard, what was harder than you expected. Who wants to go first? Otherwise, we'll just follow this. Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about the IP surrounding gene editing techniques, and basically are arguing that we want to keep that IP open access and not allow one company to have this IP. So we, I think, found it difficult to figure out who the decision maker was in that case, because it sort of falls in a lot of different jurisdictions, almost. Like IP is, about trade as well as it's about economic development. It has like aspects of science and health as well. So targeting like specific decision makers was difficult.
Did you guys come up with any solutions, ideas?
Yes, so we went with the insider approach, just because there are too many different stakeholders to target in public. Since you can't let their opinions hard individually at first, it's probably the best to go to. So, for example, the Federal Ministry of International Trade would be one go-to, and then there's one recent intellectual property strategy published by the Ministry of Science and Development. I don't know what it's called, but they produce that strategy. Yeah, so get there from you as well, because it's literally IP stuff.
And we figured we'd have an ally in the Ministry of Health.
Yeah, it's open access outside.
Were there hands over here? Yeah,
I had a question actually. So
Yeah.
if we did have like a pet project or an interest of ours that we wanted to explore with science policy, does Evidence for Democracy offer some way of providing guidance or consulting on that in some way?
Yeah, we do. So we, oftentimes people just email us and we'll either give sort of one-on-one support, and then, even most of the campaigns that we end up taking on started with a scientist emailing us saying, hey, I'm concerned about this. Even all the work that we've done around Pearl, the climate and atmospheric funding, that was those PIs reaching out to us saying, well, we've already tried writing a letter to our MP and didn't hear back, then we tried writing a letter to McKenna and we didn't hear back, what do you guys think? And so we offered them advice, and then also kind of decided it was something that we wanted to sort of fully put our resources behind. So yeah, always feel free to email us.
Can I ask a follow-up question? So a lot of the efforts that you've made, which have been fantastic, have been in response to cuts mostly from the government, which is really important that we raise your voice against them. But what about proposing new ideas or a new direction? Has that been explored by you guys at all?
Yeah, and we did do a lot of that around the Support the Report type campaign, around the NAML report, the Fundamental Science Review. We also did that with things like pushing for the recreation of the Chief Science Advisor position. So honestly, part of the challenge in pushing for something is that scientists are a very diverse group, and they don't always like to get along and all get behind the same vision. So it can be kind of problematic because you want to propose a vision of where we should go, but you can only achieve that if everyone is willing to push for it. And oftentimes times that can be challenging because not everyone will 100% agree with that vision, and instead of focusing on what they mostly agree with, they'll kind of focus on the things they don't like. So it can be, like, I'm not sure E4D alone could define that vision. So that's where the work around Support the Report was so successful, was because we had this vision in the report already laid out for us that a lot of groups decided to get behind. So certainly I would love to see something like that happen again on an even more like ambitious, longer term timescale around funding for science, that I could see a lot of, you'd have to, in order for it to really work, you'd have to get a lot of the different science groups behind it. And so I think that I could totally see something like that happen, but not right now. Like, I think the timing for that would probably be in a few years. But it's a good point. It is very different type of advocacy and different type of work if you're pushing for like a big, new, bold vision versus, trying to sort of like counteract something very specific that the government is doing. Any other thoughts, comments? Anyone want to share their ideas? Yeah.
I found that in our group we couldn't go beyond step 1. From my experience too, I feel that the biological solution or the scientific solution doesn't match with the practical solution. And as scientists, we like information, and we don't have all the information. So, I want to make a change. I want to share my opinion with policymakers, do something for them. I find step 1 to be difficult. So when you started out your research, did you find that you were heading this way, and then how can we try to develop an opinion and be confident of our opinion, and then put it out there as an advocacy?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that is, step 1 is where the research comes in. So I think it can be like the hardest and most time-consuming step, but it also should be the step that as scientists you're the most well-prepared to do, right? And I think that's where looking at research that is beyond your own domain or your own field is really helpful. I know when I started doing policy work, I honestly had no idea the amount of policy literature that there is out there. There are policy journals, all on their own, that are all about policy issues. So, like, it might be the case that within your field, so your current realm of understanding, it's really hard to, you don't know how to make the biological solution fit with something that is practical, but there might already even be some literature in the policy realm that deals with that. So especially if it's a fairly new, complex issue, it might take a lot of work to try to come up with some of these policy solutions, and that's probably not something that you're going to be able to do effectively on your own. Versus if you're doing advocacy around an issue that's already well documented, like carbon pricing, then it's a bit easier because then you can look for existing resources. Yeah.
Do you get to know like which avenue or which format of public opinion awareness is like most effective? Like, what is the evidence on, an op-ed versus a...
So it really depends on who your audience is and who you're trying to target, and that's why, doing that kind of mapping is really essential, because given all of our limited resources, it's, unless you have a very, very large ad budget, it's almost impossible to kind of get a message out to the general public, as we all like to say. That's kind of meaningless. And that's where you see, certain political movements like Trump's have been, as much as we like to think of their movements as, being against science or against evidence, the one place that they really use evidence and science and data is in messaging and micro-targeting. They send out incredibly specific targeted messages even to different people in different neighborhoods. Like, it's that micro-targeted. Whereas for some reason, other more progressive movements, as much as we love evidence and data, we tend to use it less effectively when it comes to communications. So that's where it's hard to answer in broad strokes, because it really does depend on who the audience is. Any other questions, thoughts, feedback?
I've seen some people trying to directly engage with local MPs or MPPs, by inviting them to their lab or events and things like that. Do you know if that had much of an impact, or can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, well, I think it's great. So we do a lot of work supporting individuals in doing that. It's hard to say what the immediate payoff is. I think that for a lot of this work, there's always this immediate ask that we have when you go into those meetings, usually around funding or something like that. But I also look at it as a really good investment in a longer term relationship. I often think of, the analogy of the close relationships that lawyers have with MPs, and scientists don't have those same kind of connections. Most scientists don't have their MP's number in their phone, that kind of thing. And unfortunately, that kind of relationship matters. We're actually just starting a study looking at where MPs get information from. So, actually, what sources of inputs do they get information from? And preliminary research on this suggests that a lot of it is from personal communication. So they really do kind of look to their own personal network of who they know. So that's where I think things like lab visits, it does a number of things. It shows, very directly and visually for the MP, what science is and what it does, and it puts a human face on it. It also shows that science is people. That's another message that we are actually trying to really get across. Even the fact that most science money goes towards paying people's salaries is not something that most MPs understand. So it makes that really visible, it makes it really tangible. And then, our hope is that over the long term, we're changing those dynamics so that scientists and researchers have closer connections to people who have decision-making power.
How can you find or develop a career in science advocacy, and the different roles that you can have in that field?
Yeah, it's a good question. I just kind of did it. So I don't know if there's that many careers in science advocacy per se, but there certainly are a lot of careers in science communication, science policy, and I see those, they often go hand in hand, policy, advocacy, communications. I think you just have to do what you love. If you're really passionate about, tweeting about your science, if you're really passionate about what you're doing, then I think you will excel at it and it will draw attention. It's kind of hard to plan it. I think even the few people I know who work in this kind of space, it just kind of happened very much by, not by chance, but it was, just kind of random opportunities and relationships. So it's really just kind of building relationships in the space, volunteering where you can, doing what you're interested in, and then hopefully you end up in the right place and time when an opportunity arises.
You were actually talking about how we can influence MPs, federal government, stuff like that. So I was really, from what I was actually pursuing it, I feel like it's very from job to
bottom approach? Like, do you feel like there's like a significant flow from bottom to up with grassroots movement, looking at that people who actually work with them understand from both sides that that this is actually a very important movement?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think you can't go just to the top. And a lot of work that we've done over the years has been around building grassroots movements of people who are supporting science and evidence-based decision making. I mean, the reality is you also have to accept that you can't target everybody, and that realistically this is a like wonky issue that you're not going to get everybody to care about. And
is
so,
it because, do you think that is it because like Canada is like very resource dependent economy, like you like oil and stuff like that?
no, I think it's
economic
more
side?
honestly it's human nature. Like I think this is where like reading some of these resources are really helpful in understanding that humans are not evidence-based machines. Like our brains actually really don't work in that way, and that our brains make decisions based off of our values, based off of stories, based off of emotions, and that what we're trying to convince people to do in being sort of evidence-based is actually a big ask. It's actually quite like contrary to the way our mind wants to work. And so, I just realistically, we're not gonna get everybody to care about this issue. So to be really strategic, we focus on who are the people most likely to be passionate about these issues, which is people like you. So we really stay focused on who our audience is, which we consider to be scientists, researchers, a lot of like people in tech, web developers, that kind of thing, and people I call sort of science files, like people who watch Neil deGrasse Tyson YouTube videos for fun. Like those people are our core audience, and so instead of like trying to convince people over here who I think that's going to be unlikely that we're ever going to get them passionate about this issue, instead we focus more on those people who already do care about this but aren't engaged, and instead focus on getting them engaged, supporting them, immobilizing them, training them so that they can be effective advocates.
I think that's all the time we have for questions. A few things to mention before we close for the day. So a few things that are coming up. There's a big science policy conference in Ottawa next month, November 7th to 9th. Will you be there?
I will be there.
Katie will be there. A few of us in TSPN are going. If you want to go, let us know and we can hang out. We also have our next workshop planned for November 13th. This is on Science Policy 101. And we also have a bunch of public panel discussions coming up that we have in the works. Topics are going to range from sex ed to cannabis to open data and much more. If you're interested in helping out with any of these things, just let us know. I know E4D has a workshop on science communication in a week and a half. It's a webinar, right? So you can tune in online. Anything else we would like to plug?
Yes, so I just put some buttons at the back that I forgot to put out at the start. So there's some great nerdy buttons at the back of the room. Feel free to take one on your way out. And just, I'll also add that we have, an email list. We send out a lot of resources, like more detailed sort of toolkits on things like the budget and how to meet with your MP. And we offer free training webinars as well. And we have sort of more in-depth, like science communication and storytelling line coming up in a week and a half. So website is evidenceforthemocracy.ca. So that's it.
Okay. And lastly, sorry, I keep having to do this. Again, if you're interested in helping out, you can reach us at our email or join our Slack or follow us on social media, or all three. In fact, please do all three. And of course, I want to thank again our sponsors for making this possible. I want to thank Katie for coming all the way down here. I want to thank you all for coming, and please take some more food before you go. Again, thank you so much for coming out to our second event of the year. That's it.